pleasure to be with all of you here today. And a special thanks to Rivka Solomon, whose advocacy and commitment to raising awareness for ME has caught the attention of many people in Massachusetts and across the country, including me. In Massachusetts, we're not just the Bay State, we're also the Brain State. And the fact that all of these panelists before you today earned at least 1 degree from a Massachusetts school speaks volumes to that fact. Massachusetts receives more NIH funding per capita than any other state. In 2016, NIH funded nearly 200 institutions in Massachusetts and over 5,000 grants to conduct cutting-edge research on thousands of devastating illnesses and conditions. But one disease that has not benefited from much research progress is MECFS. As you'll learn today, MECFS is a chronic, debilitating condition without a known cause, treatment, or cure. This disease has been in the shadows for too long, and today's briefing is an important step to shining a light on this condition and what we can do collectively to help improve the quality of life for those who are impacted. We still don't know a lot about MECFS, but here is what we do know. At least 1 million Americans, and likely more than double that, are living with MECFS, and the vast majority of them are women. The impact of this disease on the lives of those affected and their families is not inconsequential. While the severity of the condition can vary, many experience extreme fatigue, pain, a foggy mind and memory, and often an inability to leave the home or even the bed. In fact, Rivka's determination to come to my town hall in Northampton to sit in her wheelchair and to speak so eloquently about life with this disease was not easy for her. It just further illustrates her commitment to improving health outcomes for individuals with MECFS. And MECFS carries a substantial economic burden as well. The disease costs the country somewhere between $18 and $51 billion each year. Yet in 2015, the NIH devoted $6 million in research on MECFS compared to the $17 million the agency spent on smallpox, a disease that has not naturally occurred in the United States since 1949 and was considered globally eradicated in 1980. This isn't meant to belittle the importance of continued investments in smallpox, but it does starkly speak to the lack of attention MECFS has received from the research world. Momentum is building for this, largely because of advocacy efforts from many of the individuals who are here today. And although the NIH announced late last year that it will be committing more agency resources and research dollars to MECFS, we must ensure that promise isn't broken in this new administration. This includes fighting against President Trump's proposed 18% cut to the NIH research budget. We also have to ensure that public awareness campaigns and other federal initiatives are utilizing the most up-to-date science about this disease. Today, you will hear directly from the MECFS community about why these commitments are vital. We'll explore what is known about the epidemiology of the disease, as well as the impact of the lack of diagnostics and treatments for this condition. We'll hear from patients about what it's like to live with this disease and why additional research and attention is critical right now. It is my hope that the conversations had in this room today will shed light on MECFS and that together we can work with better diagnosis, prevention, and treatment for this condition. But this is the right room and the right building to begin to have this discussion about the underfunding of research. And I just want to thank you all for allowing me to be a part of your efforts, because I am going to be somebody who is there with you as a fighter to make sure that we increase this budget for research, because we want to make sure that children have to turn to the history books to find that there ever was such a disease. We can do this. Thank you all so much for everything that you're doing. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Again.
Wow, thank you so much, Senator Markey. Really appreciate you taking the time. My name is Emily Taylor. I'm the Director of Advocacy and Public Relations for the Solve MECFS initiative. It's my absolute pleasure, and I'm so humbled and excited to present to you this amazing panel of MECFS advocates, thinkers, researchers, scientists, bringing this disease to the forefront. These are the leaders in our field, and it is truly a joy to introduce them to you all. Jennifer Brea, furthest away from me, is a filmmaker, academic, community organizer, and co-founder of the online patient platform ME Action. An MECFS patient since 2010, she earned her bachelor's in political science from Princeton University and is a PhD candidate at Harvard in political science and statistics. In addition, she directed and produced a Sundance award-winning documentary on MECFS called Unrest, and shared her journey with unrest in a recent TED Talk entitled "What Happens When You Have a Disease That Doctors Can't Diagnose," which currently has over 1.2 million views. Closest to me is Dr. Sahira Ali, the Chief Scientific Officer and Vice President for Research at Solve MECFS Initiative. We are the nation's largest leading charitable organization for MECFS. Dr. Nalli earned his PhD in Physiology and Biophysics from Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory at Stony Brook University, and his Master's in Public Administration from Harvard University's John F. Kennedy School of Government. Dr. Nalli also completed postdoctoral fellowships at Harvard and Stony Brook. Dr. Nalli has served as the principal investigator at schools such as Vanderbilt and Cornell, and has published more than 22 interdisciplinary research papers in prestigious scientific journals. In the center, middle from me, is Carol Head, our president and CEO at the Solve MECFS Initiative. An executive with more than 25 years of success in both the for-profit and nonprofit sectors, Carol earned her BA in English from Wellesley College, Phi Beta Kappa, and an MBA from Stanford University. An MECFS patient herself, Carol has suffered with MECFS since the 1980s. Earlier this year, Carol was honored to be recognized by O Magazine, the Oprah magazine, in 2017 as a health hero, one of just 14 visionaries who are healing bodies, minds, and communities. Thank you again, and take it away, Jen.
Thank you to everyone here who made the effort and the time to come out here today to hear about this disease. And I'm really grateful for the opportunity to share my story, which is the one story, but I think a story that a lot of patients share. Senator Markey gave such a great introduction that I'm going to skip over some of these pieces and kind of jump right into my story. So 5 years ago, this was me. I was a PhD student at Harvard, and I loved to travel. I had just gotten engaged to the love of my life. I was 28, and like so many of us, if we were young and healthy, I felt like I was invincible. Then one day I had a fever of 104.7 degrees. After the fever broke, I was so dizzy, I would walk into door frames, and I couldn't leave my house for 3 weeks. I had to hug the walls just to make it to the bathroom. I got infection after infection that year, but every time I saw my doctor, he told me there was nothing wrong. He had his standard commercial laboratory tests, and they always came back normal. Some doctors even told me that I was just stressed or depressed, that it was all in my head, or that maybe it was just my final exams catching up with me. I saw every kind of specialist: neurologists, rheumatologists, cardiologists, endocrinologists. I was lucky and I had resources. It only took me 2 years to get diagnosed. But by that time, I had gotten so sick that I wasn't able even to sit in this wheelchair, and I was extremely sensitive to light and sound. I ended up confined to my bedroom without support or treatment and without even an explanation for my illness. I would go weeks without seeing my kitchen, and when I felt like I was becoming a burden on my husband, I thought a lot about taking my own life. What changed things for me was joining this vibrant community of patients around the world. I found a voice and I became a patient activist, and I started to film some of the people that I met. I'm going to show you a trailer from the film that Emily talked about, Unrest, which premiered at Sundance in January and will air on PBS early next year. And it's a look at some of the patients who are on the more severe end of the spectrum, which is a world that I think has been hidden from us for many years. This was my time before. We all have one, whether or not we know it yet.
And filmed by Jennifer Brea.
Today we talked with a U.S. student studying abroad in Beijing.
Well, I know some of us are kind of scared, actually.
I can't say that it was perfect or that I had any idea what I was doing, but it was mine, and I loved it. And then I met Omar. Three months later, I knew that I wanted to marry him. Being together, exploring the world, I thought that would be our lives.
I can't understand love. Say it again.
It's been called the yuppie flu, Epstein-Barr, and a living hell by those who suffer from it.
There's still no adequate medical explanation, but there's also a psychological factor.
If you say too little, they can't help you, and if you say too much, they think you're a mental patient.
And it was just a committee who came up with this perfectly horrid name, chronic fatigue syndrome.
Chronic fatigue syndrome. Yeah, I'm tired too.
As my body was falling apart, nothing anyone said made sense.
Hi, Jen.
I decided to tell a different story.
I have been severely unwell for 8 years.
Injection mit champagne.
Mint champagne.
This is not a story of me fighting a medical mystery and, discovering my cure against all odds. Although, honestly, I would take that story any day. And it's not young love triumphing over all. And, it is a little bit. If it were just me, you would think that this was some weird tragedy, a freak lightning bolt, and you wouldn't understand that this happens all of the time.
I'm completely bedridden. I've lost the ability to walk.
I was 10 years old when I first got sick.
I forteltet, der står der 5 betjente. Jeg sagde et eller andet med, at I kan da ikke bare brase ind til en dødssyg ME-patient.
Så kørte de med Karina, uden vi var oppe og sige farvel eller noget, så vi må ikke engang se hende eller noget.
It's an extremely complicated disease involving the immune system in the brain and who knows what else. I have to do this quickly because my son is so ill.
We still have hope. We know what the government can do with a commitment.
I've never said, oh, I'm going to beat this. The truth is, I can't possibly know. But we can fight.
I have faith that we are going to cure this, that we are going to get better, that you are going to be whole once again.
There's the sun. I'm making this film to save my life. What else can you do when your story is stolen from you, but try and write a new one? Senator Markey gave an amazing overview of some of the numbers, but I'm going to just sort of reiterate them a little bit because I think they're worth kind of digging into. So we know from the Institute of Medicine report that between 836,000 and 2.5 million Americans are affected by this disease, which means that it's at least twice as common as multiple sclerosis, and it's an extremely it's a disease that costs the economy roughly $24 billion a year. And I've been really grappling ever since I got sick, and this was not a disease I knew anything about, and I had ever really heard of before I became affected by it. And I still don't fully have the answer, but I have been trying to kind of figure out over the last many years how a disease that is this prevalent and removes millions of people from their lives, often in their most productive years, how as we have as a society, not only done almost nothing to help them, but have often added to that that marginalization and added to the stigma. And so how do we get here? I think that there are 3 core reasons. First, the stigma and misconceptions about the disease. Second, a lack of medical education. And third, a lack of research funding. And so as far as stigma goes, when you hear the word chronic fatigue syndrome, what do you think of? You think of someone who is chronically tired and perhaps a more severe version of something that we all feel from time to time. Here's how I would describe it. I feel like I am a broken iPhone battery that only ever charges to about 40%. And as long as I stay within that 40%, I look normal and I can function. But if I exceed whatever my metabolic limit is, all of my symptoms, neurological, cardiovascular, gastrointestinal, they all flare. And I will end up bedridden in a day, again, sometimes for days, sometimes for weeks, unable to speak or even lift my head. This is a spectrum disorder, so for some of us, our battery may be able to charge to 90%, and we can still work, but we have to spend a day a week in bed recovering. This is Whitney. His battery charges to probably only 5, maybe 10%. He's been bedridden now for 3 years. He can't speak. He can barely tolerate the touch of a loved one or the sound of a human voice. It is difficult for even his family to be in his room. And so he lives at home, but no one has spoken to him in years. Carol is going to talk later about some of the concrete ways that you can help us to take action, but I think that every single person in this room and every single member sitting in Congress can help us just by using the soft power of their offices to help us dislodge this image, which has done so much harm for so many years. So I invite you to support your constituents' advocacy efforts, support our National Day of Awareness, which is May 12th, when it comes again around next year, and communicate your support of this disease to the agencies that I think can and should do more to address this major public health issue. The second is the lack of medical education. So MECFS is not a part of almost any medical curricula. And Nancy Klimas, who's a doctor you saw in the trailer, when she was at the University of Miami, used to have to teach medical students during lunch about the disease because it wasn't taught at her university. It takes an average of 5 years to diagnose this, which is why I say I was lucky that I got diagnosed within 2 years. But I remain firmly convinced that if I had been diagnosed within weeks or months of the onset of my illness, that I would never have become bedridden and I would not be in a wheelchair today. There are thousands of research articles that have never been translated into clinical practice, and we have no specialty homes. So if you have a major life-altering disease, whether it's cancer or multiple sclerosis, you get diagnosed and then you get referred to a specialist. You get referred to a neurologist or to a rheumatologist, and we have no specialty homes. So if you get diagnosed by your primary care doctor, there's basically nothing that they can do for you. And the fourth is research funding, which Sen Edward Markey touched upon. So on average, for the last many years, MS patients get about $250 per patient in NIH research funding each year. For HIV, it's about $2,500 per patient. And for MECFS patients, it's about $2 to $5. And so I think one of the best visuals for this is from a paper by Dimmick and Jason, which is this funding by disease burden. And so the A that you see over there is sort of where we're funded today. And you can see that given how many people are affected and how disabled they are, this disease is dramatically underfunded and more than almost any disease that the NIH currently researches. And I would also say that it's in part because of the investment we've made over decades in HIV that I'm able to take medications that allow me to even be here today. So here's the good news. We believe that this disease is treatable and that with investment in research and clinical care, millions of people could be returned to their lives. There are so many problems that are really complicated and difficult to fix at a policy level. And I think while there are scientific challenges, on a policy level, this is an imminently fixable problem. And I think if we as a society and as a country made the choice today to invest what this disease deserves in terms of research and medical care, then millions of people could be returned to their families and to their lives. Thank you.
Thank you, Jen. Wow, heartening. And thank you all for coming today. My name is Sahira Ali. I work for the Solve MECFS initiative. There's a title slide here that says, among the mysterious illnesses that science has yet to uncover, MECFS turned out to be one of the most challenging. These are not my words. These are the words of the director of the NIH, Francis Collins. Our organization is led by Carol, our fierce leader here, and a formidable board of directors. Many of them are in this room today, but also an amazing research and scientific advisory council with many familiar faces, as you can see here, from Dr. Komarov to Dr. Montoya to Dr. Levine and Rowe and Kugelnik and Bateman and other of these thought leaders. So a shout out to them and to all the healthcare professionals who are working on this disease. These are really the true heroes after the patients and their families. As Jen has mentioned, this is a little bit of the epidemiology about the disease. We only know a little bit about the epidemiology, so that's an appropriate statement. This is a disease that affects up to 2.5 million in the United States. It affects more women than men. And listen to this number, 25% of patients become housebound or bedbound at one point in the disease illness trajectory. And 91% of patients are undiagnosed. Again, listen to that number, 91% are undiagnosed. The common cause of this disease is still unknown. We don't know the etiology of MECFS. There are no FDA-approved drugs, and there is a poor understanding or grasp of the natural history of the disease. These are some of the challenges that Jen also touched on: misinformation and antagonism. We have lack of critical mass of researchers. We have insignificant funding for research. These are related. We have several diagnostic criteria that makes it very hard to compare data and studies with fidelity. We have elusive etiology, as I mentioned, and lack of FDA-approved drugs, absent pharma investment, big pharma investment. We have insurance and ICD coding debacles. We have hard career path for researchers, no feasible biomarkers, really, and poor grasp of the natural history and minimal patient support. But for me, really the cardinal problem is really the severe knowledge gap. And let me illustrate that with this graphic. These are 4 terrible diseases plotted here on this graph, a publication per year as a function of time. And as you can see, we can define the curve for autism, Alzheimer's, multiple sclerosis. In MECFS, it is a flat line. That is our knowledge gap. This is the lack of information that is essential, and that correlates very much with investment and spending in research. In fact, MECFS ranks at the lowest, as Senator Markey said, and as Jen has mentioned, the lowest in spending. These two go hand in hand. So we have shortage really in all the domains, investigation domains that should exist in this disease, whether it is descriptive, mechanistic, therapeutic type of investigations. And we don't have time today to go through all of these problems. But at least at the basic level, at the most descriptive level, we are unable to define the natural history of the disease, which is the basic first rudimentary level. In fact, the Institute of Medicine report mentioned that we are unable to define subgroups of patients or even to clearly define the natural history of the disease. And that what we mean by that is onset, duration, recovery, functional deficits, comorbidity, and demographics, which are actually the most essential primitive element of this. And now I want to switch and tell you about some of the myths that exist in this disease and also that Jen has touched on. The first one is, your blood test came back normal. Well, what you measured in my blood came back normal. That's a very different than my blood came back normal. And next, this is actually some of our data from bloods of patients compared to healthy controls. And without going into much details, you don't need to be a scientist to see that there is a lot of color change. This is what we call a heat map. And we have hundreds, in fact, of factors in blood that are very different between patients and healthy controls. So certainly there's nothing normal about your blood. Myth number 2 is you look normal. Again, that's something Jen just mentioned. And this is a quality of life study with hundreds of patients, and MECFS always rank on the lowest score in terms of quality of life. And again, this is a test that is done at major medical centers here in the United States and across the world. And the third one, this is really what this is the big whopper. This is what bothers me, is that this is caused by depression or anxiety. And understanding that depression and anxiety are necessarily the secondary cause of any complex medical disease. It's not the primary cause. In fact, I tried as a scientist to think very hard and look at the evidence. And if there is a disease that is screaming out to you that I'm not a primary depression type disease, it's this one. We have increased cortisol level in depression and anxiety. Here we have a reduction. We have enlarged adrenal gland. Here we have a reduced in size and function of these glands. We have reduced serotonin with depression, actually a classical characteristic. Here we have increased in serotonin level. We have lack of motivation in depression. Here we have lack of energy, not motivation. Exercise improves depression. In fact, exercise leads to a crash and post-exertional malaise in this disease. Again, these are all factual data that debunk these type of misinformation out there about the disease. So the challenges persist, yet recent development are also palpable. I do not want to leave on the bad note or on the negative note that this is a disease that is that changes are not happening because of the work of advocates and researchers in the space. We have better commitment now from government agencies, and we have increased in scientific and advocacy effort. This is the statement I mentioned at the beginning of the many mysterious human illnesses that science has yet to unravel. MECFS has proven to be one of the most challenging. Francis Collins. And I took the liberty here of chronicling some of these changes that has happened in the last 2 years, starting with the IOM report that led to a decision to bolster MECFS at the NIH, and then the establishment of the intramural study, and then supplemental awards, and then a common data element project as a collaboration with the CDC, between CDC and the NIH, and several other facts, small steps, but meaningful steps, including NIH director blog on MECFS and recognizing MECFS by the NIH and the CDC as a major health crisis. And again, that would not have happened without the determined stakeholder, patients and their families, as well as organizations like us and others. Now we are seeing MECFS being programmatically established at major key medical centers, and that's something we are working hard towards. And we are looking forward to these upcoming consortiums as well, which is another policy change that has happened recently that is positive. So at least that is on the positive side. We have some movement. And if we step back and think about really why we are in this predicament, the central question is that this is a disease where it has been defined traditionally by symptoms, not by biomarkers. And the question is, are there underlying objective abnormalities? I just showed you before in the myth section that we have numerous objective abnormalities. Now let me go through a few of them as well right now. What is looking like is that we have a very serious defect in 4 major categories: bioenergetics, neuroendocrine system biology, immunology, and microbiome. And this is the literature here that support these kind of abnormality and defects and dysregulation. Again, we will skip that in the interest of time, but I'm happy to talk to you about this later. This is not only a disease that is rooted in biological and physiological abnormality. It is a very complex disease, in fact, that is rooted across different fields and areas of medicine and biomedicine. So to me, it's the way I define this is I look at it as the MECFS iceberg. It is there, it is deep, we only know what's above the surface, and there are lots of work to be done yet. And let me finish by one more slide here. to show you how we think about science and policy. It's that paradigm. No matter how tall our ladders are in terms of our breakthroughs and our discoveries, absent of visionary policies, we are not able to keep going upward. We keep going back. And these are some of the shoots that I call them here, shoots: poor quality research, maladaptive policies, poor investment in science and technology, inability to retain talent, and mostly a profit-driven private sector investment, as well as misinformation, and importantly, politicizing innovation, science, and discovery. So we have to guard against that. I zipped through this very quickly, in the interest of time, and thank you so much for being here. Now I'll hand it to Carol. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nalli. And I think, one interesting comment, you've heard his credentials. And, when you look at our organization, the Solve MECFS Initiative, you can sort of put us in the space of other patient disease research organizations like Michael J. Fox, Susan J. Komen, very familiar names, one working on Parkinson's, one working on breast cancer. And they have budgets in the range of $700 to $800 million a year. We are arguably among the largest organizations in the world working on this disease, and our budget is, in comparison, $1.7 million a year. So I think one of the many fascinating things about Dr. Sahira Ali is not only that he uses chutes and ladders as a great analogy. With those of us who are over 45 probably know what that means, and the rest of you, I'm so sorry, we can explain it later, but he could go anywhere and do anything. And this is a guy who, we all hear what I have now learned to some degree is the myth of genuine intellectual stimulation and interest in research and in uncovering difficult medical research problems. And that really describes Sahir. It's very unusual that he has joined a small organization like ours and is using his prodigious talents to help uncover this disease. And he is passionate about it, I can tell you. So let me just give you a little perspective on the disease. I think some of this we've covered in previous slides. This is a disease that has been known of for at least 30 years, and certainly goes way back. There are indications of historical figures who likely had this disease as well. So the challenge is that although everything you've heard today from Jen and from Senator Markey and from Dr. Nalli is that we still lack a unified federal response to this disease. And there have been some efforts here and there at CDC, NIH, I will say, although probably a little late, like a couple decades on the uptake to begin to invest in this disease, has in the recent year begun to do some serious work in NIH. It will be hard for us to catch up for those 3 decades in which substantial work was not done, but also at AHRQ and HRSA, which those of you who are policy people will know those acronyms, are very important to moving forward not only the medical research, but the dissemination of information in our society so that doctors are educated and so that the disease is taught in medical school. So the needs are great. And we are in our organization, and Jen in hers and others, are really, truly picking up where the federal government has failed us. And I say that as a citizen who loves this nation and has always believed in the power of government. And we're here because we believe in the power of government. It really is the obligation of CDC, NIH, and these other agencies to care for their citizens. And so we do pick up the slack where we can, and our dollars are minuscule compared with what we know could be done when NIH, CDC, and the others truly engage. So I think you've seen this slide. Really the disparity in spending per patient is shocking, frankly. And then part of me says, well, maybe not such a big deal. You might have thought that an hour ago before you learned as much as you have. Maybe it's not that serious a disease. But when you put together the prevalence of the disease, how common it is, and I will say to you, every one of you in this room knows someone with MECFS. It is so common. Of every 250 Americans, there's 1 or 2 who has it, and you all know more than 250 people. So you do know people with this disease. What you may not know is that you know they have it, and they may not know, as only 10% of patients are diagnosed. And so start to think about it. Your mother's high school friend who could never quite leave the bedroom, what was that? So when you put together the prevalence of the disease, the enormous severity of the disease, there is really no cogent argument for the underfunding that has occurred from our government. So, and again, I think Jen has expressed better, Jen has expressed beautifully the pain and suffering, and really behind Jen stand several 100,000 Americans who are in the same sort of situation. And we ran a billboard in Times Square, and really, let me just, so the gentleman on the upper left-hand side was a sophomore at Stanford University when he became sick. And now he's so sensitive to light and sound that he lives in a state of sensory deprivation. He must cover his eyes and his ears and can't watch TV, can't read a book, can't listen to a podcast. So that's his life and has been for many years. He actually has been hospitalized now for 3 months, has come home, and I will say his survival is not guaranteed. This disease can be fatal. And so there's Tom before and after. Glamour magazine, before and after. And, not only the pain and suffering for Tom and his family, but as a culture, our society, the loss of his energy and brilliance, I think is invisible to us. But here it is. And then on the upper right is a young woman who also is quite sick and who has to be fed by a tube. I don't know if any of you have experienced that. It is extremely uncomfortable. And that's in addition to the other suffering that she has. And then at the bottom is a young woman, and this is not uncommon, whose mother has learned she can't leave her bed, she can't go to a doctor, so her mother has learned to give her drips, regular drips of saline to help keep her blood pressure up and to give her nutrition. And so these photos do describe the 25% or so of extreme patients, and they are out there, all of them right now, and behind them stand hundreds of thousands of others. So let me take this now from a different perspective. Let's go to the policy aspect of this. We all understand what happens in our culture when research and medical facts lag behind when they're way ahead of cultural understanding. We look at this as the way MS was in the 60s. When it was believed to just be the bad nerves, nervosa. It was not believed to be a genuine physical ailment. And I think all of us are young enough to remember that autism, even in the 90s, was blamed on cold parenting. And it's humiliating now to believe that we could have had such misconceptions about such serious, painful, and debilitating diseases. And so we're all creatures of our culture, and this disease has been laughed off as a joke, as you heard on the commentary in Jen's film. And I've been told, I'm tired too, Carol, just get over it. So we've seen this pattern before in our culture. And I will just say that really there is a special kind of hell reserved for individuals who have a disease before our culture understands it. They not only suffer with the disease, but they suffer with not being believed and not being supported. So we now know better about autism and MS. And why is that? It is because of advocacy by Jen and others in this room, Annette Whittemore and others, who have mustered the strength, despite illness, to come to Congress and go forward and advocate for work. That's what changed the world with AIDS. That's what changed the world with MS. That's what changed the world with autism. And we are now beginning that process. So you all in this room are key for us. You will help us change our culture, our world, and give hope to patients. So let me just be very specific about why we are in this hall of power today. The more we can engage you all with us to do the right thing, we have a couple key asks. First, we are asking for support for funding for research and clinical programs at the NIH, CDC, and AHRQ. And let me say, part of our work as advocates is we both are passionately I will use the word angry, and at the same time, we understand that sitting at the table with folks in the agencies and in Congress who to educate them, to help them understand, and to understand their point of view is the way you get things done. So we have strong relationships at NIH and CDC. And I will say, you know, we are well aware that Congress should not, it is not appropriate to tell NIH what to do. And at the same time, I have heard personally from folks at NIH that it is indeed helpful because internally, within the massive bureaucracy that is the NIH, internally, the word is getting out within NIH that yes, indeed, this is a serious disease. And it really does make a difference for researchers internally at NIH to do more and more work on this issue. So it is important. And one of the asks we have had in these couple days here on Capitol Hill is to sign a letter to Senator, to Director Collins, and I hope that you all, with a better understanding now the severity of this disease, will sign on for this. We also, a second ask is, there's the PPH fund, you know, let me just step back. Boy, are we in a topsy-turvy week here in Washington, in a topsy-turvy month and a topsy-turvy quarter. So we understand that there are many issues that are occurring here. And one of them is healthcare. And the entire healthcare issue is complex and daunting. But where we come out is no matter where you stand on the political spectrum, this disease knows no party. It is not a Republican or a Democratic disease. And so, you know, I also have this I'm fundamentally optimistic that in the midst of all the difficulty, you know, what will happen with pre-existing conditions? What will happen with chronic disease? You know, this is a chronic disease. What will happen with some of those issues, particularly the issue of looking at chronic diseases like MECFS, is critically important. Now, one of the unfortunate elements, just procedurally, because this is where you all staffers live, is that the minuscule $5.4 million that has been allocated to the CDC, specifically line item for MECFS, unfortunately is bound up in this $1.2 billion appropriation to, Emily, I always get the acronym wrong, the PPH fund that is really tottering and may go away. What's so demoralizing for us is that funding for the CDC $5.4 million existed as a line item before it got folded into that larger fund. So, and we are working with folks in Congress, and we hope you'll be among them to strategize how to not lose the small $5.4 million for this disease at CDC that was present before it got folded in. Let's don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. So look, I've said what I need to say about the policy elements of this. For us, this is the start. Well, I'd say we're in the second inning of a long. We will not go away. We will be with you forever until this disease is conquered. And so we will be back next year and every year until we really get the appropriate level of funding. So for us, we are primarily a research organization. The vast majority of our budget, under the direction of Dr. Nalli, goes to research. It is a minuscule budget. And so we've added on this advocacy component because at the end of the day, we understand that we will never have sufficient private money to solve this disease. And so we must continue to work with you to work toward what needs to be done for justice for MECFS patients at NIH and CDC. And, you know, my final little optimistic thought is, you know, boy, these are tough times for you. I don't envy any of you. But, you know, great things can happen in tough times. This is that little flower that comes up through the cracks in the sidewalk where you can be part of doing something that matters and is good and that serves millions of Americans. And I thank you so much for being with us here today, and hope that you will join us in continuing to have justice for patients who suffer with MECFS. Thank you so much.